When Arthur Sterling stood up at his son's wedding and pulled out a gun, 312 guests thought they were about to witness a father's blessing. Instead, they witnessed an execution. The bride collapsed at the altar in her ivory lace gown, blood spreading across the antique blue Persian rug of Holy Name Cathedral. But here's what makes this case absolutely devastating. Arthur didn't know his future daughter-in-law was hiding a decade-old secret that would destroy his family's legacy until a distorted audio recording played through the chapel speakers moments before he pulled the trigger. Someone at that wedding wanted Ava Reynolds exposed, and they made sure Arthur Sterling would be the one to end her life. This is the story of a Chicago wedding day massacre, a medical fraud cover-up, and a mystery that still haunts investigators today. If you're drawn to cases where desperation collides with vengeance, and where buried secrets demand the highest price, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. Because what happened in Chicago on that September afternoon will leave you questioning how far you'd go to save the people you love. Before we continue, thank you for giving this story your time. If you feel like it, feel free to share where you're listening from and what brought you to Cold Trail. It quietly helps us do this work. Now, let me tell you what happened to Ava Reynolds. Saturday, September 14th, 2024. Chicago, Illinois, 3:47 p.m. The sanctuary of Holy Name Cathedral was a masterpiece of old-world elegance, vaulted ceilings soaring 60 feet above, stained glass windows casting jewel-toned light across the polished marble floors, and cascading arrangements of white roses and calla lilies framing the altar. Rows of mahogany pews were filled with Chicago's elite, dressed in designer suits and silk gowns. A children's choir hummed softly near the entrance. The air carried the scent of expensive perfume, candle wax, and the faint autumn breeze drifting in from Michigan Avenue just 4 blocks away. Ava Reynolds stood at the altar in a custom lace gown with delicate cap sleeves. Her dark hair swept into an elegant updo adorned with pearl-tipped pins. Her hands rested in Marcus Sterling's, her fiancé now husband, who looked at her like she'd rescued him from a life of emptiness. Ava was more than beautiful. She was radiant, composed. A 30-year-old pediatric surgeon who'd spent the last decade climbing out of Chicago's darkest neighborhoods to stand here in this cathedral, surrounded by people who would never understand the price she'd paid to arrive. Marcus Sterling was everything Ava had never dared to dream of. A 33-year-old tech philanthropist with a foundation that funded children's hospitals across the Midwest. A man whose family name opened doors Ava had only ever seen from the outside. He wore a tailored black tuxedo, his warm smile never leaving her face as the officiant prepared to continue the vows. Behind them, in the third row, Arthur Sterling sat rigid in his seat. His silver hair was perfectly combed. His expression was stone. He'd raised Marcus to believe in legacy, in bloodlines, in the idea that family honor was something you protected at all costs. And for months, Arthur had been watching Ava, studying her, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal what he'd uncovered about the woman his son was about to bind himself to forever. That moment was now. 10 years earlier. February 2014. Chicago, Illinois. The fluorescent lights in Northwestern Memorial Hospital's cardiac care unit hummed with the kind of persistence that made Ava want to scream. She sat in the plastic chair beside her brother's bed, watching the monitors track Leo's failing heart with mechanical indifference. 22 years old and already an expert at reading the numbers that separated hope from grief. Leo was 19, and according to every doctor who'd reviewed his case, he had maybe 6 months left. Maybe less. The dilated cardiomyopathy had come on fast, aggressive, unforgiving. One day, Leo was playing pickup basketball at the park, near their apartment in Pilsen. The next, he was collapsing on the court, his heart too weak to pump blood through his body. The transplant list was their only option, but Leo's position kept sliding down as sicker patients with better insurance or better connections, moved ahead of him. Ava had watched it happen 3 times in the last 4 months. 3 times she'd allowed herself to believe they were getting close, only to have some administrator call and explain that someone else needed the heart more urgently. Ava knew what that really meant. Someone else could pay more. Someone else had the right last name. Leo stirred in the bed, his breathing labored even with the oxygen tube running under his nose. He'd lost 30 pounds since the diagnosis. His brown skin had taken on an ashen quality that made him look like he was already halfway to becoming a ghost. When he opened his eyes and saw Ava sitting there, he managed a weak smile. "You're still here," he whispered. "Where else would I be?" Ava reached for his hand, careful not to disturb the IV line running into his forearm. "Med school, studying, living your life." Leo's voice cracked. "Not sitting in this room watching me die. You're not dying." Ava said it with more force than she felt. "We're going to get you that heart." Leo closed his eyes. "Ava, we both know how this works. I'm not rich. I don't have connections. I'm just another poor kid from Pilsen who got unlucky." He paused, struggling for breath. "You need to let me go." "No." The word came out sharp, final. Ava had spent her entire childhood protecting Leo after their mother died and their father disappeared into a bottle. She'd worked 2 jobs to keep them fed. Had fought the foster care system to keep them together. Had clawed her way into medical school with loans she'd never be able to repay. All so she could build a life where Leo would be safe. She wasn't about to stop now. She left the hospital at midnight and walked the 4 blocks to her apartment through streets slick with February rain. Chicago in winter felt like punishment, the wind coming off the lake with enough force to strip skin. Ava barely noticed. Her mind was churning through options, desperate calculations, impossible math. Leo needed a heart. The system wouldn't give him one. Therefore, she needed to break the system. The text message came 2 days later from a number she didn't recognize. "Heard about your brother. I can help. Meet me at Lou's Diner. Tomorrow, 9 p.m. Come alone." Ava knew she should delete it. Knew that nothing good came from anonymous offers of help. But she also knew that Leo had maybe 4 months left, and the transplant list wasn't moving. She texted back a single word: "Okay." Lou's Diner was a 24-hour greasy spoon on the border between Pilsen and Little Village, the kind of place where cops and criminals ate breakfast side by side and nobody asked questions. Ava arrived at exactly 9, scanning the booths until she saw him. Mid-50s, gray suit that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe, hands folded on the table like he was conducting a business meeting. Which, she supposed, he was. Ava Reynolds. He said her name like he'd been saying it for years. "Sit down." She slid into the booth across from him, her heart hammering. "Who are you?" "You can call me Vincent. I work with people who need things the system won't provide. He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made Ava's skin crawl. Your brother needs a heart. I can make sure he gets one. How? Vincent leaned back, casual, confident. The transplant system runs on a database. Medical records, insurance information, urgency codes. All of it digital, all of it accessible if you know the right people. We have people inside the hospitals, inside the insurance companies. We can move your brother up the list. We can make sure the next available heart goes to him. Ava's mouth went dry. That's illegal. Yes, it is. Vincent's expression didn't change. It's also effective. We've done this before, multiple times. The success rate is excellent. And what do you want in return? Your skills. Vincent pulled out a tablet, slid it across the table. On the screen was Ava's entire academic record, her medical school transcripts, her work history. You're smart. You understand medical systems, insurance protocols, how records get processed. We need someone like you to help us with other cases. People who can't afford the surgery they need. People the system has abandoned. You help us fix their records, and we make sure your brother gets his heart. Ava stared at the tablet, her hands shaking. This was fraud. Conspiracy. The kind of thing that could destroy her career before it even started. Could land her in prison for years. But Leo was dying, and Vincent was offering her the only option that would save him. How long would I have to do this? She asked quietly. Until your brother is stable. A year, maybe 2. Then you walk away. No questions asked. We're not monsters, Ava. We're just people who understand that the system is broken, and sometimes you have to break it further to make it work. Ava looked out the window at the Chicago streets. At the city that had given her nothing but obstacles and heartbreak. At the world that was perfectly content to let Leo die because he didn't have enough money or the right insurance. She thought about her mother, who died of treatable cancer because they couldn't afford the medication. She thought about all the ways the system had failed people like her, like Leo, like everyone who'd ever been told that their life wasn't worth saving. She looked back at Vincent. When do I start? 3 weeks later, Leo received a call from Northwestern Memorial. A heart was available. Ava sat in the waiting room for 8 hours, while surgeons transplanted a stranger's heart into her brother's chest. And when they finally came out to tell her the operation was a success, she cried for the first time since their mother's funeral. Leo lived, and Ava became a criminal. The work started small. Vincent would send Ava encrypted files containing patient records that needed adjustments. An urgency code bumped up here, an insurance authorization fast-tracked there, a specialist referral pushed through without the usual 6-month wait. Ava would review the files during her rare free hours between med school lectures and clinical rotations, make the changes using access credentials Vincent's people provided, and upload the modified records back into the hospital systems. Clean, efficient, invisible. At first, Ava told herself she was helping people. The patients in Vincent's files were like Leo had been desperate, overlooked, trapped in a medical system that treated their lives as a matter of cost-benefit analysis. A 58-year-old woman who needed a kidney transplant but kept getting pushed down the list because her insurance wouldn't authorize the anti-rejection medications. A 16-year-old boy with leukemia whose parents couldn't afford the experimental treatment that might save him. Ava fixed their records. manipulated the databases, and watched from a distance as they got the care they needed. But the work grew darker. By the end of her first year, Vincent wasn't just sending her cases of desperate patients. He was sending her cases of wealthy clients who wanted to skip the line, who were willing to pay enormous sums to move ahead of legitimately sicker people. A businessman who needed a liver transplant and didn't want to wait. A politician's wife who wanted immediate access to a cardiac specialist. Ava started to understand that Vincent's operation wasn't about helping the helpless. It was about selling access to anyone who could afford the price. She tried to refuse. Vincent reminded her that Leo's heart transplant had been paid for by the same system, that she'd already crossed the line, and that walking away now would only mean exposing herself to criminal prosecution. He had records of everything she'd done, every file she'd touched, every database she'd compromised. If Ava tried to leave or go to the authorities, Vincent would make sure she spent the next decade in prison. So Ava kept working. By day, she was the model medical student top of her class, praised by her instructors, on track for a prestigious residency in pediatric surgery. By night, she was someone else entirely, someone she didn't recognize when she looked in the mirror. She developed insomnia, lost weight, started drinking coffee by the pot just to stay awake through the endless cycle of lectures, clinical rounds, and late-night record manipulation. Leo recovered beautifully from his transplant. He went back to school, started working part-time at a community center teaching basketball to kids, talked about maybe becoming a social worker someday. He had no idea what Ava had done to save him. No idea that his second chance at life had come at the cost of her soul. The breaking point came in November 2016, 2.5 years after Ava had made her deal with Vincent. She received a file for a 7-year-old girl named Maya who needed a heart transplant. Maya's parents were immigrants, working class, no connections. According to the file, she'd been on the transplant list for 8 months. Vincent's instructions were simple. Move Maya down the list to make room for another patient. A 45-year-old executive who was willing to pay $200,000 to jump the queue. Ava stared at the file for an hour, her hands shaking. This wasn't about helping people anymore. This was about condemning a child to death so a rich man could live. She thought about Leo at 19, dying in that hospital bed, and imagined someone making the same calculation about him. She thought about the person she'd been before all of this started. The person who'd gone into medicine because she wanted to save lives, not trade them like commodities. She deleted Vincent's instructions and closed her laptop. Then she picked up her phone and sent a single text. "I'm done. I can't do this anymore." Vincent's response came within minutes. "We need to talk. In person. Same place. Tomorrow night." Ava met him at Lou's Diner one last time. Vincent sat in the same booth, same gray suit, same predatory calm. "You can't just walk away," he said before she'd even sat down. "Watch me." Ava remained standing. "I'm not doing this anymore. Find someone else." Vincent's expression hardened. "I have documentation of every file you've touched, every record you've altered, every federal crime you've committed. If you walk away, I'll send it all to the FBI, the medical board, every news outlet in Chicago. Your career will be over. Your brother will find out what you did to save him. You'll spend the next 10 years in prison. Then do it." Ava's voice was steady now, calm in a way that surprised her. "Because I'd rather go to prison than keep doing this. At least in prison, I'll still be myself." She turned and walked out of the diner before Vincent could respond. She expected him to follow through on his threats, expected federal agents to show up at her apartment or reporters to start asking questions. But nothing happened. Days passed, then weeks, then months. Vincent never contacted her again. Either he'd decided she wasn't worth the risk of exposure, or he'd moved on to someone else who was more compliant. Ava threw herself into her residency at Chicago Medical Center, working 100-hour weeks, volunteering for every difficult case, trying to atone for what she'd done by saving as many lives as possible. She changed her phone number, moved to a new apartment in Lincoln Park, cut ties with everyone from her old life except Leo. She stopped sleeping well, started seeing a therapist she paid for in cash, learned to live with the weight of her past pressing down on her chest like a stone. She told herself she'd gotten away with it, that she'd made a terrible choice, paid her penance through sleepless nights and guilt, and now she could move forward. She told herself that the person who'd worked for Vincent was someone else, someone she'd left behind in the dark places of Chicago's underworld. She almost believed it. Ava met Marcus Sterling on a Tuesday in April 2022 at a fundraiser for the Chicago Children's Hospital. She'd been reluctant to attend these events, were always full of wealthy donors who treated doctors like performing monkeys, asking them to tell heartwarming stories about saving children while writing checks that would cover a fraction of what was actually needed. But her supervisor had insisted, and Ava had learned that sometimes you swallowed your pride and smiled for the people with money. Marcus had approached her near the silent auction tables, holding a glass of wine and wearing a smile that seemed genuinely warm rather than performative. "You're Dr. Reynolds," he said. "I heard you speak at the Medical Ethics Conference last month. Your paper on pediatric care access was brilliant." Ava had been so surprised that someone at a fundraiser had actually read her work that she'd fumbled her response. They'd talked for 20 minutes about healthcare policy, about the failures of the insurance system, about the ways that medicine had become more about profit than healing. Marcus had listened with the kind of attention that made Ava feel like her words mattered, like she wasn't just another voice shouting into the void. He'd asked for her number. She'd given it to him, half expecting never to hear from him again. But he'd called the next day, and the day after that. And within a month, they were having dinner twice a week at quiet restaurants where Marcus insisted on hearing about her day, her cases, the children she'd saved and the ones she'd lost. Marcus Sterling was everything Ava had never allowed herself to want. He was brilliant without being arrogant, wealthy without being ostentatious, passionate about using his resources to make the world better. His tech company had developed software that helped hospitals coordinate organ transplants more efficiently. Ironic, given Ava's past, but she'd learned to smile through the irony. He came from old Chicago money, the kind of family that had buildings named after them and appeared in society pages. But he seemed uncomfortable with the privilege, always talking about how he wanted to do more, be more, matter more. They fell in love slowly, carefully, like two people who'd both been hurt before and were afraid to move too fast. Marcus never pushed, never demanded more than Ava was willing to give. When she had nightmares and woke up gasping, he held her without asking questions. When she worked 36-hour shifts and came home too exhausted to speak, he made her tea and sat with her in comfortable silence. For the first time since she'd walked out of Lou's diner, Ava felt like she might be able to build a life that wasn't haunted by her past. She felt like she might deserve happiness after all. Arthur Sterling had different ideas. Marcus's father was everything. Marcus wasn't cold, calculating, obsessed with legacy and bloodlines, and the idea that the Sterling name represented something pure that needed to be protected. He'd built his fortune in commercial real estate, buying up Chicago neighborhoods and transforming them into luxury developments that pushed out the working-class families who'd lived there for generations. He believed in hierarchy, in the natural order of things, in the idea that some people were simply better than others. From the moment Marcus introduced Ava to his parents at a stiff dinner in their Gold Coast mansion, Arthur had looked at her like she was something he'd scraped off his shoe. She was too young, too ambitious, too clearly from the wrong side of the tracks. Her medical career impressed him not at all in Arthur's world. Doctors were service workers, people you hired and dismissed. The fact that Ava had grown up in Pilsen, that she'd worked her way through school, that she didn't come from money or connections, all of it marked her as fundamentally unsuitable for his son. Marcus had laughed off his father's disapproval. "He'll come around," Marcus had promised. "He just needs time to see how incredible you are." But Arthur Sterling wasn't the type to come around. He was the type to dig deeper, to find the leverage he needed to break things apart. In September 2023, 6 months after Marcus had proposed to Ava in a quiet moment on the lakefront, Arthur had hired a private investigator. The investigator's name was Thomas Kincaid, a former Chicago PD detective who'd made a second career out of digging up dirt for wealthy clients. Arthur's instructions had been simple. Find out everything about Ava Reynolds, and find out what she was hiding. Because Arthur was certain she was hiding something. Women like her always were. Kincaid had started with the obvious: Ava's academic records, her employment history, her financial statements. Everything looked clean on the surface. Model student, exemplary resident, no criminal record, no suspicious transactions. But Kincaid knew that clean surfaces often meant someone had worked very hard to scrub away the dirt underneath. He'd dug deeper, tracking Ava's movements during her medical school years, interviewing people from her old neighborhood, following digital trails that had been carefully but not perfectly erased. It took him 4 months, but eventually Kincaid found the connection to Vincent's operation. He found hospital records that had been altered during the exact time period when Ava would have had access. He found encrypted communications on servers that had been thought to be secure. He found financial transactions linking Ava to a network of medical fraud that had operated across Chicago for nearly a decade. He'd presented his findings to Arthur in January 2024, 8 months before the wedding. Arthur had sat in his office reviewing the evidence with the focused intensity of a man who'd just been proven right about everything he'd suspected. Here was proof that Ava Reynolds was exactly what he'd thought: a criminal, a fraud, someone who'd manipulated systems and destroyed lives for money. The fact that Ava had done it to save her brother didn't matter to Arthur. The fact that she'd walked away from Vincent's operation years ago didn't matter. The fact that she'd spent every day since trying to atone for her mistakes didn't matter. All that mattered to Arthur was that Marcus was about to marry someone who would taint the Sterling name, who would introduce criminal blood into a family that had spent generations building respectability. Arthur had considered exposing Ava immediately, but Kincaid had advised patience. "If you reveal this now, Marcus will defend her," Kincaid had said. "He'll say she was desperate, that she made a mistake, that she's changed. He'll marry her anyway out of spite. But if you wait until the wedding, until the moment when the whole world is watching, the humiliation will be complete. Marcus will have no choice but to walk away." So Arthur had waited. He'd smiled through the engagement party, the wedding planning, the rehearsal dinner. He'd watched Ava try so hard to earn his approval, to prove she was worthy of his son, and he'd said nothing. He'd let her believe she'd gotten away with her past, that she could simply leave it behind and step into a new life. He'd had the audio recording prepared weeks in advance, a compilation of phone calls and digital communications from Ava's time working with Vincent, edited together into a devastating 3-minute summary of her crimes. He'd arranged for it to be uploaded to the cathedral's sound system, timed to play during the vows. At the exact moment when Ava would be most vulnerable, Arthur Sterling believed in justice. He believed in protecting his family. He believed that some people were simply meant to be punished for their sins, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make sure that punishment was delivered. The distorted voice cut through the cathedral like a blade through silk. Every head turned toward the speakers mounted in the stone columns. Every conversation died mid-sentence. Every smile froze into an expression of confusion, and then horror as the words became clear. You think she's a savior? Ask her where the money for her brother's heart really came from. Ava's hands went cold in Marcus's grip. She watched his expression shift from joy to confusion, watched him mouth the word "what," as if he could make the voice stop by questioning it. But the recording continued, relentless, mechanical, stripping away every carefully constructed layer of her new life. Ava Reynolds, also known as the Ghost, medical fraud specialist for the Castellano organization, 2014 to 2016. She didn't just save her brother, she condemned dozens of patients to die by moving them down transplant lists. She sold access to organs like they were commodities. And now she's about to marry into one of Chicago's finest families. The cathedral erupted into chaos. Guests stood from their pews, pulling out phones, turning to their neighbors with wide eyes and open mouths. Bridesmaids clutched each other. Ava heard someone near the back shout, "Call the police," and someone else respond, "They're already on their way." Marcus was staring at her now, his hands still holding hers but loosely, like he'd forgotten they were there. "Ava," he said quietly, and his voice was so broken that she wanted to die right there, wanted the floor to open up and swallow her before she had to see the rest of his illusions shatter. "Tell me this isn't true." "Marcus, I can explain." Ava started, but the words died in her throat, because how could she explain? How could she make him understand that she'd done it out of love, out of desperation, out of the kind of grinding poverty that made people do things they'd never thought themselves capable of? How could she tell him that she'd tried to atone, that she'd walked away, that the person she'd been wasn't the person she was now? The recording ended with a final, devastating line. Ask her how many people died so her brother could live. Ask her if she thinks that was justice. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Ava could feel 300 pairs of eyes on her. Could feel the weight of their judgment, their disgust, their satisfaction at watching someone who'd climbed too high come crashing down. She turned slowly, scanning the congregation, trying to find the source of the recording, trying to understand who had done this and why. That's when she saw Arthur Sterling standing in the third row. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Marcus with an expression of grim satisfaction, like a man who'd just completed an unpleasant but necessary task. And in that moment, Ava understood everything. The private investigator, the months of cold politeness, the way Arthur had smiled at the rehearsal dinner like he was counting down to something. He'd known all along. He'd waited for this exact moment to destroy her. You, Ava breathed, pointing at Arthur. You did this. Arthur's expression didn't change. I protected my son from a criminal. Marcus turned to his father, confusion replacing the heartbreak on his face. Dad, what are you talking about? Did you know about this? I've known for months. Arthur's voice was calm, measured, the voice of a man who believed absolutely in the righteousness of his actions. I had her investigated. Every word in that recording is true. She's a fraud, Marcus. A criminal who manipulated hospital systems and sold organs to the highest bidder. She was going to bring that corruption into our family. So you humiliated her in front of everyone. Marcus's voice was rising now, anger cutting through the shock. You couldn't have just told me? You had to do it like this? You wouldn't have listened. Arthur stepped into the aisle, his hand moving toward the inside of his tuxedo jacket. You're blinded by what you think is love. You would have defended her, married her anyway, destroyed everything our family has built. I couldn't allow that. Ava saw the movement before Marcus did. Saw Arthur's hand emerge from his jacket holding something black and metallic. Saw his arm come up. Saw his finger find the trigger. She had maybe 2 seconds to process what was happening. 2 seconds to understand that Arthur Sterling hadn't just come to expose her, he'd come to erase her. This is how we protect our bloodline, Arthur said quietly, and pulled the trigger. The gunshot was louder than anything Ava had ever heard. It seemed to echo off the cathedral's stone walls, to reverberate through the vaulted ceiling, to shake the stained glass windows in their frames. She felt the impact before the pain, felt something punch through her chest with enough force to knock her backward. She stumbled, her legs giving out, Marcus's hands losing their grip on hers as she fell. The blue Persian rug rushed up to meet her. Ava's white gown spread around her like wings, and she watched with strange detachment as red began to bloom across the ivory lace, spreading outward from the hole in her chest. She could hear screaming now, could hear Marcus shouting her name, could hear footsteps pounding as people ran toward the exits, or toward her, or toward Arthur. She couldn't tell anymore, couldn't process the chaos unfolding around her. Marcus was on the floor beside her, his hands pressing against her chest, trying to stop the bleeding. No, 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 he was saying, over and over like a prayer. Ava, stay with me. Please stay with me. She tried to speak, tried to tell him that she was sorry, that she'd loved him more than she'd ever loved anything, that she'd only wanted to leave the past behind and build something clean and good with him. But her lungs wouldn't work properly. Blood filled her mouth, copper and thick, and all she could do was look up at his face and watch him break apart. Arthur hadn't moved. He stood in the aisle with the gun still in his hand, his expression serene, like a man who'd just completed a difficult but morally necessary task. Around him, guests cowered in their pews or fled toward the exits. The bridesmaids were screaming. The children's choir had scattered. The cathedral doors burst open and police officers flooded in, weapons drawn, voices shouting commands that Ava could barely hear over the roaring in her ears. She saw them surround Arthur, saw him place the gun on the pew and raise his hands without resistance, saw them force him to his knees and secure his hands behind his back. Through it all, Arthur kept his eyes on Marcus, kept that same calm expression, like he was waiting for his son to thank him. More police arrived, and then paramedics rushing toward Ava with equipment and urgent voices. They pushed Marcus aside, cut open her gown, pressed gauze against the wound that was stealing her life one heartbeat at a time. Ava watched it all from somewhere far away, her vision narrowing to a tunnel, her body feeling lighter with every passing second. She thought about Leo at 19, dying in that hospital bed. Thought about the choice she'd made to save him, the line she'd crossed, the person she'd become. Thought about all the years she'd spent trying to outrun that choice, trying to build a new life on a foundation of secrets and silence. She'd thought she could leave the past behind. She'd thought she could erase who she'd been and become someone new. But the past never stays buried, and secrets have a weight that only grows heavier with time. The last thing Ava saw before the darkness took her was Marcus's face, tears streaming down his cheeks, his lips forming her name over and over again like he could call her back from wherever she was going. She wanted to reach up and touch his face, wanted to tell him that none of this was his fault, that he'd given her the only real happiness she'd ever known. But her hand wouldn't move, her breath wouldn't come, and as the cathedral lights faded to black, Ava Reynolds thought about a 7-year-old girl named Maya and wondered if this was what justice felt like. The crime scene investigators arrived 20 minutes later to a cathedral transformed into a tableau of violence. Police had cordoned off the altar area with yellow tape. The blue Persian rug was soaked with blood. Ava's body lay covered by a white sheet, the outline of her wedding gown visible beneath it. Evidence markers dotted the floor, numbered placards marking the location of the gun, shell casings, blood spatter patterns. Detective Sarah Miller stood at the entrance taking in the scene, her notebook already filling with observations. 32-year-old bride shot at her own wedding. Father of the groom in custody. Confession already obtained. Audio recording that precipitated the shooting currently being analyzed. Open and shut case, except for the strange look in Arthur Sterling's eyes when they'd photographed him at the station. Not guilt, not regret, but satisfaction. Miller had been working homicide in Chicago for 8 years. She'd seen domestic violence, gang shootings, robberies gone wrong, crimes of passion and crimes of calculation. But she'd never seen anything quite like this. Never seen a man shoot his future daughter-in-law at the altar, in front of 300 witnesses, and then stand there waiting to be arrested like he'd just completed an errand. She walked slowly up the aisle, careful not to disturb any evidence, studying the faces of the guests still being interviewed by uniformed officers. Most looked traumatized, shell-shocked, like they couldn't quite believe what they'd witnessed. But a few looked something else vindicated, maybe, like the recording had confirmed suspicions they'd always harbored about the bride who'd come from nowhere and captured the heart of Chicago's golden boy. Miller reached the altar and knelt beside the covered body, lifting the sheet just enough to see Ava's face. Even in death, she was beautiful. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins, fanning across the rug. Her eyes were closed, her expression almost peaceful. Miller had read the initial report, pediatric surgeon, no criminal record, engaged to Marcus Sterling for 18 months. But the recording told a different story, one that Miller knew she'd need to verify. "Detective?" A young officer approached, holding an evidence bag. "We found this in the groom's father's jacket. Looks like some kind of remote trigger device." Miller took the bag, examining the small electronic device inside. "For the audio recording? That's what we're thinking. He could have triggered it remotely, timed to play at the exact moment he wanted." Miller looked back at the altar, at the blood-soaked rug, at the white sheet covering the woman who'd been minutes away from becoming a wife. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was premeditated, planned, executed with precision. Arthur Sterling had wanted maximum impact, maximum humiliation, maximum devastation. The question was, why? And Miller had a feeling the answer was going to take her places she didn't want to go. Detective Sarah Miller spent the next 72 hours reconstructing Arthur Sterling's path to murder. She started with the obvious, interviewing the private investigator Thomas Kincaid, who'd initially refused to talk until his lawyer explained that client privilege didn't extend to conspiracy to commit murder. Kincaid had provided copies of his investigation files, detailed records of how he'd tracked Ava's connection to Vincent's medical fraud operation. But it was the digital forensics that broke the case open. Miller's team had seized Arthur's phone, laptop, and home computer. And what they found was more damning than anyone had expected. Arthur had kept meticulous records of everything, emails to Kincaid with instructions to dig deeper, calendar entries marking when he'd received updates on the investigation, drafts of the audio recording he'd compiled from intercepted communications. He'd even kept a journal, handwritten entries detailing his growing conviction that Ava needed to be permanently removed from his son's life. The journal entries were chilling in their rationality. Arthur wrote like a man conducting a business merger, weighing options and outcomes with cold precision. Early entries discussed simply exposing Ava's past and trusting Marcus to make the right decision. But as the months progressed, Arthur's tone had shifted. He'd become convinced that Marcus was too weak, too blinded by emotion, too willing to forgive. The only solution, Arthur had written 3 weeks before the wedding, was to ensure that Ava could never corrupt the Sterling bloodline. Miller sat in the interrogation room at Chicago PD's Central Station, reviewing the journal entries one more time before her scheduled interview with Marcus Sterling. She'd put off talking to him, giving him space to grieve, but they were now 72 hours past the shooting and she needed his statement. Marcus arrived at exactly 2 in the afternoon, accompanied by his lawyer but looking like he'd aged 10 years in 3 days. His eyes were hollow, his skin gray, his expensive suit rumpled like he'd been sleeping in it. He sat across from Miller without speaking, his hands folded on the metal table. "Mr. Sterling," Miller began gently, "I know this is difficult. I'm sorry for your loss." Marcus's laugh was bitter, broken. "My loss? My father murdered the woman I loved in front of 300 people. And you're sorry for my loss. I need to ask you some questions about your father's behavior in the months leading up to the wedding. Did he ever express concerns about Ava? Ever suggest she might not be suitable?" "He expressed concerns constantly." Marcus's voice was flat, exhausted. "From the moment I introduced them, he thought she was too young, too ambitious, too poor. He couldn't understand why I'd choose her when I could have married someone from our social class. I thought he was just being his usual elitist self. I didn't realize he was planning to murder her." Miller slid a copy of one of Arthur's journal entries across the table. "Your father hired a private investigator in September of last year. He discovered Ava's involvement in medical fraud and decided not to tell you. Instead, he waited 8 months, compiled evidence, and planned to expose her at the wedding. Did you have any knowledge of this investigation?" Marcus read the journal entry, his hands shaking. "No. God. No. If I'd known, if he'd just told me. His voice broke. I would have talked to Ava. She would have explained. We could have dealt with it together. So you didn't know about her past involvement with Vincent Castellano's medical fraud operation? Not until that recording played. Marcus looked up at Miller, his eyes wet. And you know what the worst part is? I would have understood. Ava's brother was dying. She was desperate. She made a terrible choice and spent the rest of her life trying to make up for it. She saved children, detective. Every single day, she saved children. That's who she was. Not the scared 22-year-old who made one desperate deal with criminals. Miller made notes, then pulled out another document. Your father wrote in his journal that he believed exposing Ava wouldn't be enough. He wrote, Marcus will forgive her. He'll see her as a victim rather than a criminal. The only way to truly protect our family is to ensure she cannot corrupt our bloodline. Marcus stared at the words for a long moment. He was planning to kill her all along. That's what the evidence suggests. The audio recording wasn't meant to stop the wedding. It was meant to create chaos, to put Ava in a vulnerable position where your father could act. He brought the gun to the church. He waited for the perfect moment. This was premeditated murder. Mr. Sterling. Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I need to see him. That's not advisable. I don't care. Marcus's voice was hard now, angry in a way that made Miller understand. This was a man who'd been too gentle his whole life, and was finally allowing himself to break. My father murdered the woman I loved. I need to look him in the eye and ask him why. Miller considered, then nodded. I can arrange that, but only with supervision. Arthur Sterling was being held in Cook County Jail pending his arraignment. They'd placed him in isolation for his own protection. Wealthy men who shot their sons' brides tended not to do well in general population. Miller led Marcus through the security checkpoints, through the concrete corridors that smelled of disinfectant and despair, to the visiting room where Arthur waited behind reinforced glass. Arthur looked exactly the same as he had at the wedding. Silver hair perfectly combed, posture erect, expression calm. He picked up the phone on his side of the glass when Marcus sat down, and his first words were, I did what needed to be done. Marcus's hand tightened on his own phone. You murdered her. You murdered Ava in cold blood in front of everyone we know. I eliminated a threat to our family. Arthur's voice was steady, reasonable, like he was explaining a business decision. She was a criminal, Marcus. She manipulated medical systems, sold access to organs, destroyed lives for profit. And you were going to marry her, to bring her into our family, to let her corrupt everything we've built. She saved her brother's life. Marcus's voice rose, echoing in the small room. She was desperate and scared, and she made a mistake. But she walked away from it years ago. She dedicated her life to helping children. She was a good person who did a bad thing, and you couldn't see past your own prejudice to understand that. Arthur shook his head slowly. You're still defending her. Even now, even after everything, you're defending a criminal. This is exactly why I had to act. You would have forgiven her, married her anyway, destroyed our family's reputation. Our family's reputation? Marcus laughed, and it was a sound without any humor. Dad, you shot an unarmed woman at a wedding. You're going to spend the rest of your life in prison. You didn't protect our reputation, you destroyed it. For the first time, something flickered in Arthur's expression. Uncertainty, maybe, or the first hint that his careful calculations had missed something crucial. The courts will understand. I was protecting my son from a criminal. Any father would have done the same. No. Marcus leaned close to the glass. Any father would have talked to his son, would have trusted his son to make his own decisions, would have given the woman his son loved a chance to explain herself. But you didn't see me as an adult capable of making choices. You saw me as property that needed to be protected from contamination. I saw you as my son who was being manipulated. I loved her. Marcus's shout made Miller flinch from her position by the door. I loved her. And you killed her. And now I have to live the rest of my life knowing that the happiest moment of my life turned into the worst, because you couldn't let go of your obsession with bloodlines and legacy and all the other bullshit you've built your identity on. Arthur's composure cracked. Just slightly. I was trying to save you. You destroyed me. Marcus stood, his hand still gripping the phone. And the worst part is that you still don't understand what you've done. You still think you were right. You'll go to your grave believing you were protecting me instead of understanding that you took away the only person who ever made me feel like I mattered for something other than my last name. He hung up the phone and walked out without looking back, leaving Arthur Sterling sitting alone behind the glass, his carefully constructed worldview finally beginning to crack around the edges. Miller watched Marcus go, then looked back at Arthur. The older man was still holding the phone to his ear, still sitting with perfect posture, still wearing that expression of righteous certainty. But something in his eyes had changed. For the first time since the shooting, Arthur Sterling looked uncertain. Miller hoped it was the beginning of understanding. But she suspected it was just the first symptom of a man realizing that he'd sacrificed everything, his son, his freedom, his legacy, for a principle that turned out to be worth nothing at all. 6 months after the wedding that ended in murder, Leo Reynolds stood at his sister's grave in Oakwood Cemetery on Chicago's South Side. The headstone was simple black granite with her name, dates, and a single line he'd chosen. She gave everything to save the ones she loved. The November wind cut through his jacket, carrying the smell of dead leaves and approaching winter. Leo was 29 now, healthy and alive because of a heart that should have gone to someone else, because of a sister who'd crossed lines that should never be crossed, because of desperation and love and all the impossible choices that poverty forces people to make. He came to the grave every Sunday, had been coming since they'd buried Ava in September. And every time he asked her the same silent question, was it worth it? He knelt and placed fresh flowers, white lilies, her favorite, against the headstone. I testified at Arthur Sterling's trial yesterday, he said quietly, speaking to the earth that covered his sister. They wanted me to talk about what you did. The prosecutor was trying to prove that Arthur was right to be concerned about you. That maybe his reaction was extreme, but his fears were justified. Leo's hands tightened on the flowers. I told them the truth. I told them you were 22 years old watching your little brother die because the medical system decided his life wasn't worth saving. I told them you made a deal with criminals because it was the only option you had, and that you walked away from it the moment you realized you were becoming someone you couldn't live with. I told them you spent every day after that trying to atone, saving children who might have died without you. A jogger passed on the cemetery path, headphones in, oblivious. Leo waited until they were gone before continuing. The defense attorney tried to use my testimony to justify what Arthur did. Said you were dangerous, that you'd proven you were willing to break the law, that Arthur was just protecting his family. I wanted to jump over the witness stand and strangle him. Leo sat back on his heels, exhausted by the weight of it all. The judge said Arthur Sterling would spend the rest of his life in prison without possibility of parole. Marcus was there. He didn't look happy or sad or anything. He just looked empty. Like someone had scooped out everything inside him and left a shell. The wind picked up, scattering leaves across the grave. Leo watched them settle before speaking again. You know what haunts me, Ava? What keeps me awake at night? It's knowing that you saved my life by destroying yours. Not just at the wedding, though, that was the final price, but every single day you worked for Vincent. Every record you changed, every database you manipulated, you were chipping away pieces of yourself, and you did it for me. His voice broke. I wish you'd told me. I wish you'd woken me up that night before you met Vincent at that diner and said, Leo, I found a way to save you, but it's going to cost me everything. I would have said no. I would have rather died at 19 than live knowing what you sacrificed. But even as he said it, Leo knew it wasn't true. At 19, dying in that hospital bed, he would have taken any chance at life. He would have let Ava cross any line, break any rule, destroy any part of herself if it meant he got to live. That was the terrible truth about desperation. It made everything seem justified in the moment. It was only later, when you were healthy and alive and standing at your sister's grave, that you understood the real cost. The prosecutor asked me if I felt guilty. Leo said, if I felt responsible for what happened to you. I said yes, because how could I not? But the truth is more complicated than that. The truth is that our whole system is built on making people like us feel grateful for crumbs, while people like Arthur Sterling hoard everything. You wouldn't have needed to work for Vincent if healthcare wasn't a commodity. You wouldn't have been desperate if my life had been valued the same as someone with money and connections. Leo stood, his knees aching from kneeling on the cold ground. But that doesn't make what you did right. And it doesn't make what happened to you justice. It's just tragedy, compounded by more tragedy. All the way down. He thought about the letter Ava had written him 5 years ago, after she'd walked away from Vincent. She'd never sent it. Leo had found it in her apartment after she died, tucked into a medical textbook. In it, she'd written, I made choices I can never undo. I helped people who needed help, and I helped people who just wanted to cheat the system. I saved you, and in doing so, I probably condemned others. I have to live with that weight every day. But Leo, if I had to do it over again, if I was standing in that diner with Vincent offering me the only way to save you, I think I'd make the same choice. Because you're my brother. And I love you more than I love being good. Leo had read that letter 100 times in the past 6 months. He kept it folded in his wallet, carried it everywhere like a talisman or a curse. Some days he read it and felt overwhelming love for his sister. Other days he read it and felt crushing guilt. Most days he felt both simultaneously. The emotions so tangled together he couldn't separate them. The reporter from the Tribune called again. Leo said to the grave, They want to do a story about you. The bride who lived 2 lives, or some sensationalist garbage like that. They want me to talk about your past, about Vincent, about whether I think you deserved what happened. I keep saying no, but they keep calling. He crouched down one more time, touching the cold granite of the headstone. I'm going to keep saying no, Because your story isn't about scandal or crime or wedding day massacres. It's about impossible choices and desperate love and the way poverty makes people into something they never wanted to be. It's about a system that forces people to choose between morality and survival, and then punishes them for choosing wrong. Leo stood and turned to leave, then stopped. There was one more thing he needed to say, one final truth he'd been avoiding for 6 months. You were right, Ava. In that letter you never sent, you wrote that truth is the only foundation that can support a future, that anything else is a house of cards waiting to collapse. You knew it even then, years before you met Marcus. But you didn't follow your own advice. You built your new life on secrets and silence, and when the wind finally came, everything fell apart. He took a shaky breath. I'm trying to learn from that. I'm trying to build something honest, something that won't collapse the moment someone looks too closely. I'm going to social work. School figured I should use this heart you bought me to help kids like we used to be. And when people ask about you, I'm going to tell them the truth. All of it. The desperate choices and the criminal work and the years of atonement. The woman who saved children and the woman who manipulated medical systems. Because you were both people. Ava, you were complicated and flawed and beautiful, and you deserved better than what Arthur Sterling did to you. Leo turned away from the grave and walked toward the cemetery gates, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. Behind him, the white lilies stood bright against the dark granite, a small spot of beauty in a landscape of loss. Truth is the only foundation that can support a future. Anything else is a house of cards waiting for a single gust of wind. Ava had written those words 5 years ago, understanding instinctively what she'd refused to practice. She'd spent a decade trying to outrun her past instead of facing it, building a life on secrets instead of honesty, hoping that if she just worked hard enough and saved enough children and loved Marcus well enough, the foundation wouldn't matter. But foundations always matter. And secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a weight that only grows heavier with time. They press down on everything you build above them, weakening the structure, creating invisible cracks that spread slowly until one day at a wedding, in a cathedral, in front of everyone you love, the whole thing comes crashing down. Leo had learned that lesson watching his sister die. Now he carried it with him every day, a bitter knowledge earned through unbearable loss. The truth might hurt. The truth might cost you opportunities, relationships, the life you thought you wanted. But lies cost more. Lies cost everything. And in the end, Ava Reynolds had paid that price in blood on a cathedral floor, wearing a white dress stained red, her future stolen by a past she'd tried so hard to leave behind. If this story got under your skin the way it got under mine, don't just walk away from it. Hit subscribe. Share this episode with someone who needs to hear about Ava Reynolds and the impossible choices desperate people make. Drop a comment about what you think. Was Ava a victim or a criminal? Was Arthur Sterling evil or just a father protecting his family? Because these questions don't have easy answers, and that's exactly why we need to keep talking about them. Cold Trail exists because stories like this one matter. Because real people make impossible choices every day in a system designed to break them. Because understanding how tragedy happens is the first step to preventing it. So show up. Share this story. Make sure Ava's life and death weren't for nothing. That's how we honor the victims and learn from the past, by refusing to look away when things get complicated and uncomfortable. Subscribe, share, comment. And remember, truth is the only foundation that can support a future. Everything else is just borrowed time.